was a dark, rainy night. The city lights threw their colors across the wet streets, and I was in my taxi looking for anyone who might need a ride. That's when I saw him, a young, drenched boy, visibly shaken, waving by the rear door. Without a word, he opened the back door and got in. Despite the pounding rain and the crash of thunder, I could make out the pallor of his face in the flicker of the traffic lights. His gaze was lost, empty, as if he were trapped in a private world made of fear and anxiety. The tension around him was almost tangible. It was impossible to ignore. Still, it was my job to take him where he needed to go. Pointing out an address, his voice barely rose above the patter of rain drumming the taxi roof. "Take me to the old Mawalpot neighborhood, please," he murmured. "It's a quiet area with old houses where families have lived for generations, a bit removed from the noise and lights of the city." If it hadn't been for his trembling tone and nervous eyes, I would have thought he was just a kid going to visit his grandparents. On the way, the anxiety surrounding him grew more intense. His fingers tapped restlessly on his knees, in a steady, unsettling rhythm I could just hear over the engine and the rain. Every so often he darted a nervous look toward the windows, as if he expected to see something out there in the darkness. Trying to lighten the mood, I started a conversation, commented on the weather, mentioned a silly saying about the rain I'd heard on the radio that morning. No matter what I said, he only answered with monosyllables. His gaze stayed fixed on the aisle between the seats. His mind was clearly somewhere else. After a few failed attempts, I let him sit with his thoughts. Even so, something inside me, some morbidly human curiosity, needed to know what was going on with this kid. Mustering my nerve, I asked him directly what was worrying him so much. At first, he brushed off the question, muttering something about having a bad day and just wanting to get home. But as we kept driving through the relentless downpour, his discomfort seemed to grow. Unease, fear, anxiety. Those emotions flashed in his eyes whenever the headlights washed across his face. After a long silence, he began to speak again. His voice was a whisper, barely audible above the engine, and the rain pounding on the roof. He confessed he had been playing with forces he didn't fully understand, experimenting with spiritism in an attempt to communicate with the unknown. Since then, he told me, things in his house had started to change. Even when he couldn't see them directly, he would notice their shadows moving at the edges of his vision, dark, shapeless forms that seemed to hover at the periphery. At night, he heard inexplicable noises, footsteps in empty rooms and whispers so faint they seemed to seep from the walls. Things began to move around with no explanation. Small objects, keys, books, vanished from where he had left them, only to reappear in bizarre places, like inside the freezer or under the bed. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night to find the doors and windows standing open, even though he was certain he had left them closed and padlocked before going to sleep. His voice trembled as he revealed these details, and his wide, terrified eyes seemed to reflect images of horrors only he could see. I didn't know whether to believe him. Even so, his words and his obvious fear filled me with a dread I couldn't shrug off. Terror is contagious. Without realizing it, I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see the same shadows he kept describing, gathering in the corners of my own car. As his story continued, the atmosphere inside the taxi grew tighter, heavier. I started to notice small, unsettling details. The mirrors seemed darker when I looked into them. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following us. The meter began to flicker erratically, and the radio spat bursts of static that sounded too much like distorted voices. My skin prickled. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay calm, but the anxiety took hold of me. When we finally reached the address he'd given me, I realized we were facing an old, abandoned mansion. Everything was dark except for a faint light that flickered in an upstairs window. The boy had told me stories of shadows and strange sounds, and now we stood before a place that looked like the perfect stage for his tale. The house, sunk in darkness, rose like a menacing presence in the night. He got out without a word. His footsteps echoed on the empty street as he headed for the front door. I watched the door creak open. A thin light leaked from inside, then suddenly went out, and he disappeared. The mansion returned to a deeper darkness, and the silence grew heavier. I pulled away, relieved to be leaving that unsettling place. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me as I drove off. It was as if the darkness around it were alive and aware. As the distance between the taxi and the house grew, I decided to take one last look in the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. Standing in the middle of the road, where the boy had been just seconds earlier, was a dark figure, motionless. I couldn't make out any features, but I was sure it was staring at me. Instinctively, I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put as much space as possible between me and that figure. It didn't matter how fast I went. Every time I looked in the mirror, it was still there, fixed in the middle of the road like a shadow carved out of the night. Only when I reached the city lights and the bustle of nightlife did I dare look again. This time the road behind me was empty. The dark figure had vanished, but the terror I felt that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the boy's story and the shadow that watched me from the darkness. It was another grey, rainy day when a middle-aged man climbed into my cab. He wore a worried, tired look, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He gave me an address on the outskirts, a place even I, an old hand at this job, barely knew. During the ride, his phone started to ring. He pulled it from his pocket, frowned at the screen, tried to answer. Then the call dropped. I didn't think much of it until it happened again, and again. Each time the phone rang, he tried to pick up, and each time the call cut out. His frustration grew. I tried changing the subject, making small talk, but it was obvious something was unsettling him. His brow knotted in confusion, and his eyes seemed lost. The atmosphere in the taxi tightened with every missed call. The rain hammered the roof, steam fogged the windows. None of it helped the feeling in my gut. After the fifth dropped call, he let out a long, frustrated sigh and handed me the phone with shaking hands. In the dim cabin light, I saw the call log clearly. A list of missed calls, all from the same number, the very number assigned to the phone he was holding. How does someone receive calls from their own number? I tried to find a logical explanation and came up short. He looked just as baffled, and in his eyes I saw a fear I hadn't seen before. We still had a long stretch of road before we reached the destination, and each passing minute felt like an hour. The sound of that phone ringing had become a knife cutting through the quiet of the cab. Every time it rang, the color seemed to drain a little more from his face. When we finally arrived, he stepped out quickly and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a dread I couldn't shake. The house sat far from the city, isolated and barely visible through the thick scrub surrounding it. Its exterior looked neglected and antiquated, which only made the scene feel eerier. With a last glance at his phone and the faintest nod toward me, the man walked to the door. His figure vanished into the dark. For a few moments I just sat there, staring at the spot where he had been, trying to process what had happened. The lights inside the house remained off. The silhouette of the building seemed to merge with the night. Everything in that scene shouted unease. My instincts told me to leave at once. I started the engine. The sound felt jarringly loud in the stillness, and pulled away. I checked the mirror, half expecting to see him waving goodbye. No one was there. Another night, colder and darker, I picked up a group of 5 young people. They had that infectious energy of youth, piling into the cab with laughter and jokes. They gave me an address I didn't recognize, but the night was quiet and I wasn't worried. They chatted as we drove, their voices filling the taxi with stories of adventures and shared experiences. Then I noticed a change. Their voices dropped, the laughter thinned. Eventually they stopped talking and only whispered to each other, throwing me the occasional glance. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road. When we reached the address, I realized we were in a desolate alley, far from any sign of life. The world around me felt blurry. My head pounded with the rush of my own pulse. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, one of the youths leaned close to my face. The mocking smile he wore is an image I'll never forget. I tried to move, but the cords binding me were tight. They bit into my skin with each attempt. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as the truth of my situation slid over me like a venomous snake. Our eyes met, 5 pairs, full of anticipation and cruel joy. How could I have been so naive? How did I ignore the subtle signs of what they intended? They started laughing. Their laughter filled the night, echoing through the silence and branding me with its cruelty. I wouldn't give up. I couldn't. Even as the paralyzing weight of despair tried to sink into my chest, I knew I had to fight. I forced myself to think, to remember a trick I'd learned years ago as a kid. I began to work my wrists in a particular motion, trying to slacken the cord. Meanwhile, I kept talking to them, anything to distract them. I needed time. Fear gave way to determination. I wouldn't let these kids hurt me without a fight. As the cord loosened, hope lit in my chest. I just needed a little more time. When I finally freed one hand, the relief was brief. I knew the fight had barely begun. With a hoarse growl, I lunged, shoving one of them, and staggered to my feet. I thrashed and kicked like a cornered animal. Terror burned off, replaced by a raw, stubborn fury. They were surprised by the resistance. That only fueled me more. I shouted, a ragged, desperate cry. My lungs burned, my throat felt raw, but I kept yelling, praying against all odds that someone would hear. It was like a miracle. A passerby appeared, heard my screams, and called the police. At the sight of the flashing lights, the youths panicked and tried to run, but it was too late. The officers caught them and cut me free. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a victory over fear, over those who tried to harm me. That feeling of vulnerability, the sense that your life can be snatched away, it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my days. Late another night, I picked up my last passenger, a woman in her 40s. She asked me to take her to the outskirts. Though the route is almost deserted at that hour, I agreed. We followed a lonely road flanked by empty fields. Suddenly there was a heavy jolt, and the car began to wobble strangely. I checked the mirror and felt a chill. One of the rear wheels had come off and was rolling into the dark. I braked hard. The woman let out a small cry of surprise, then calmed when I explained. I told her I'd call a tow truck, but when I pulled out my phone, there was no signal. I decided I would have to change the wheel myself. I took the jack and the spare from the trunk and got to work. She stayed inside, watching. The only light came from the car's beams and the pale moon. The silence was broken only by the clink of tools and my own breathing. When I finished, I wiped the sweat from my forehead and headed back to the driver's seat. As I opened the door, a scream tore the night. The woman was pointing toward the fields. Her face was a mask of pure terror. I followed her gaze, and my heart stopped. My eyes locked onto a surreal scene, and for a second fear rooted me to the spot. The figure was oddly tall and slender, a dark, threatening outline against the pale moonlight. It seemed to be watching us with a chilling stillness, standing motionless beside the wheel we had lost. The woman screamed again, panic filling her voice. That broke the spell. I jumped back into the car. My heart hammered harder than it ever had. I slammed the door, turned the key, and shot one last glance at the figure. For a horrible instant, I thought it took a step toward us. With a roar, I accelerated, putting as much road as possible between us and that terrible silhouette and the stray wheel. The woman clutched the seat with trembling hands. I tried to reassure her, but my voice sounded distant, frayed. Driving back toward the city, every shadow along the road seemed to move. Every sound swelled in the sinister quiet of the night. When we reached her destination, she stepped out without a word, her face still drained of color. I watched her go inside before pulling away, cruising through the empty city streets toward my own home. That night, the image of the dark figure and the runaway wheel followed me into my sleep, a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Since that experience, I've avoided that road after dark, afraid of whatever might be lurking out there in the night.